Good morning to everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm here with my esteemed panelists to discuss a minor question of the 21st century, which may in fact determine the course of the century, which is relations between the United States, which has been the world's #1 since World War II ended in rubble throughout Europe, and China, the world's great rising power. I'm joined not only by my friend and colleague Tom in Washington, D.C., but also by Keyu, who is professor of economics at the London School of Economics, and once again by Dingxin Zhao, who is a retired professor of sociology from the University of Chicago. Kay, if I could perhaps start with you. As I said, the United States has been #1 for a long time. And rarely in history have we seen a peaceful transition to dominance in global power. And that is what we're looking at potentially right now. Do you think that China and the US, with their intense rivalry, can avoid war at some point, and how?
First of all, I think there are not irreconcilable differences between the two powers, but more the problem stems from a lack of effective communication, misunderstanding, and most importantly, a lack of trust that has grown. And yes, fundamentally, there is competition and potentially rivalry, but that does not get the two countries to war. If you have followed what the premier of China has said, and that really represents what the Chinese people feel, that he said China will not tolerate chaos and instability in the region. And we underestimate how important peace is for the Chinese people, who, having gone through huge vicissitudes, understand that currently there's still the goal for the families to educate their kids, buy an apartment in the city, and peace is the fundamental condition to deliver that.
So why then has Xi Jinping made so many threatening noises about Taiwan, and why have there been provocative military maneuvers around Taiwan? If peace is the goal, isn't that dangerous?
Well, provocations go both ways between the two countries. It's hard to say, who has escalated what. First of all, if we look back at another rising power in the 19th century, the US, let's not forget about the Monroe Doctrine, where the rising power ousted European powers from its continent. So I think China, it is true that China is going to assert more power in the region, along with regionalization of trade and so forth. But I think strategic ambiguity is also a Chinese method to raise the awareness that these provocations can lead to potentially miscalculations, and therefore both sides need to take the temperature down.
Tom, are you there? You've disappeared from the screen. I guess. Oh, Tom, you are there. Can you hear me? Yeah.
I hear you just fine.
Yeah. You were in China and Taiwan earlier this year, and you wrote quite extensively about the lack of trust, which is something Keyu just alluded to. But in spite of it all, trade between the US and China hit a record last year, and no two global antagonists have ever been so intertwined. What do you think that means for the relationship, which, as you've written, is plagued by this mistrust? I mean, the US bought $40 billion of Chinese toys, games, and sports equipment last year. Given that level, given the level to which the countries are linked, how dangerous is the relationship really?
Well, there's always the chance, Roger, for an accident, but my general view is that the US and China are doomed to compete. And they're doomed to get along, ultimately. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be, as I say, accidents, but I think at the end of the day, there's just an overwhelming interest in both capitals to find a way to work things out. I do think, though, that there has been a shift in the quality of the relationship that has come about over the last decade or so. And that's unfortunate. I do believe that it's not a shift that began in America, but came about basically because of a change in power in Beijing. China was on a pretty clear trajectory since 1978, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, of integrating closer and closer with the world and being a little more open every year. Anyone who's visited China over that period has experienced that. I had the joy and pleasure of doing bookstore events in China, back in the late 80s and early 90s. It's one of my personally just biggest book markets. But China is a more closed place today. I think, well, there's no question. President Xi felt that openness, some of the corruption that came with it, was threatening the power and stability of China, the power of the Communist Party. And he decided he was ready to trade some level of economic growth and integration with the world for a greater level of control. But I don't think that has to lead to war between our two countries, or that it will. And so I think at the end of the day, we are, as I said, we're doomed to figure out a way to live with each other.
What do you think of the Biden administration's policy toward China, this determined effort to check China, to view it as a rival, to limit certain forms of investment, semiconductors, et cetera? Has it been the right policy? Has it gone too far? Has it been too confrontational? I live in France. President Macron believes it's too confrontational, and that we risk losing China to Russia, is a line you often hear in Paris if this line is pursued, and that Europe's interests vis-a-vis China are not the same as the American.
Yeah, I'm in the camp, Roger, of let's build bridges where possible and draw red lines where necessary. I have written, over the last a few years of columns that I would fall in the category of, could somebody tell me exactly where this is going?
Well, if you don't know, Tom, how is anyone else supposed to know?
Yeah, no, well, exactly. But I'm saying I'm questioning the administration on this. Where is this going? And what I would simply say is that I think some of the administration have asked that, and I think you've seen in the last 3 months with a number of high-level trips by Biden administration economic officials, Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, the Secretary of the Treasury. There's been a kind of pulling back a little bit, and a desire, I think, to see if we can recenter the relationship a little better. So, as I say, a lot of this was an inevitable, Roger, outcome of the fact that we've entered a very different world economically, where trust becomes so much more important when you're involved in, say, building a global supply chain for chips. These are incredibly intimate relationships that require a lot of trust. And when you enter a world where everything is dual use, from your TikTok to your refrigerator, anything that is connected is now dual use, then trust becomes the coin of the realm. And to a degree that hadn't been before in international commerce. I think China's got to adjust to that. I think both sides should be asking themselves some really important questions. I think the question China should be asking itself about the future of this relationship: how was it that we, China, had the most powerful, the most influential, the most free lobby in Washington, D.C., called the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the U.S.-China Business Council? I mean, the American business community that did business with China was an incredibly powerful lobby, source of ballast in the relationship between these two countries. And China lost that lobby. So that wasn't something the administration ordered. These were people who decided for very commercial reasons, for the very commercial reasons that kept them putting pressure on the US government to maintain an open and non-confrontational relationship with China. China lost that. And because of the fact that too many companies felt that China was not playing by the rules. Now, at the same time, America has so benefited from the inflow of Chinese students, Chinese professors who have enriched our universities and enriched our companies. And we need to be asking ourselves some very tough questions that what are we doing? What are we saying when so many of these people are starting to say, I don't think I want to make my future here. I'm afraid to make my future here. So, yeah, as I said, I believe that we're doomed to figure this out. We're in that kind of situation of tugging back and forth as we go to a different kind of
doomed to get along. Yeah. Thank you very much. I would remind everyone that it's 4 a.m. in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure I can be that lucid at that time of day, but thank you, Tom, for doing this. So Dingxin, how dramatically, in your view, has President Xi changed China? He's become president for life. Mm-hmm. We've seen the end of term limits, crackdown on Hong Kong, which caused the New York Times to move its Asian headquarters to Seoul, crackdown in Xinjiang, aggression, provocations in the South China Sea, a much more aggressive pushing of an alternative China model, whatever exactly that is, on the world. So what has the Xi effect been, and how does that change the equation? Presumably he will be around for quite a while.
I think it's, look on the surface, it changes a lot. But deeply, China did not change much. That's what I have to say, because, like say publications, it's, like Tom said, increasingly you get difficult to publish for this reason, that reason. But people say it anyway, and WeChat, I receive everything every day. So I think it's, I don't know exactly how, the direction China will go. But certainly what Tom said, because if we lost the US lobby for business groups, and that actually, in a way, if it relates to discussion today, and China was not a rival of US anymore. I don't think China economy will, goes the trajectory of 2010. Then actually, through at least economic perspective, and China could be rivalry. But now I don't think China will be, the gap will be widened. And the Chinese side have to think what's going on. They have, and another thing that the kind of rivalry also I really believe there's a mistrust. And because we see China as a rivalry from United States perspective, perfectly understandable. Everything's Westphalia. Whenever there's a transition power, you get big trouble in the US, in the West. But China is another kind of power, a power which is with the culture and mentality, which I also call it, is not so zero-sum.
Sorry, that's what?
Not so zero-sum.
Yeah.
They never thought other people game is always China's loss. It's, it makes China in a way, sometimes Chinese not so principled, because they're not zero-sum. But on the other hand, they may not see, like say, for example, among Chinese intellectual circles, including myself. Okay. Among Chinese intellectual circles, including myself, we may not even think American more engagement in Southeast Asia, South China Sea a bad thing. We thought it's much better for America come here to negotiate while have a more smooth power transition. And also, the Chinese had actually one thing trust for the United States. It's really built into Chinese early modern experience. That's why they call American 美国, beautiful country. Because you don't have a colonial tradition. No Chinese had any intention to think American could invade China, have any interest in Chinese territory. And the Chinese actually so far was actually the strategic goal, even it's a big country. It's essentially Taiwan and South China Sea. And I don't, represent the government to say, but on the other hand, I'm at Xi's age. We are grown up by this kind of patriotic nationalist discourse. And this discourse was Taiwan, we lost Taiwan because we defeated by Japan. Okay. And this is discourse which is, I think every country has, to a certain level, be respected. Of course, not respected. China can do anything over there, you know. But on the other hand, because just like yesterday, we go to the museum, and one of the statues was still in the British Museum, and the lady talked about it wonderfully, you know. It's a nationalist discourse, but I respect her, and which I think is nice. So in a way that how much Chinese discourse should be respected. And this kind of discourse had certain historical values, but nevertheless, you know, US, you know. So this is the thing which is, I think this minimum trust built from the basic China is still forever a regional power. It's not going to,
Thank you. Yeah. Keyu, do you think the Chinese system is vulnerable in any way? Would you be completely shocked if in the next decade, perhaps 2 decades, there was some radical change that the tensions, the economic tensions, the political tensions within the country could blow up in some form, or do you discount that entirely?
In short, I think the system is stable, mostly because it's adaptable, and that it has adapted greatly according to current circumstances. And if I were to characterize Chinese system, you know, most people think about China as an extremely centralized system. It is political centralization, but an extreme form of economic decentralization, much more decentralized than pretty much all the other economies. If you look at the distribution of unicorn companies, technology companies valued at around $1 billion or so, it's distributed all around China geographically, not just in Shanghai and Shenzhen and Beijing, but everywhere. Why? The local officials on the ground supporting local entrepreneurism and creativity. And these, they're getting smarter and smarter, so that's changing. And also, the Chinese people, they don't have any appetite for an overhaul of the system for the reasons that I've mentioned, is that, don't forget, there's almost 1 billion people in China still today living under $300 per month, not reaching middle income. What's on their mind? Not everybody wants to write a free op-ed every weekend, but they want to send their kids to school. They want to have free access to education and health. That's the pragmatism that's still that is kind of on their minds.
1 billion people in China living on under $300 a month. I think that's worth repeating and thinking about. Secretary Blinken, Keyu said earlier this year, Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have sustained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years. So first of all, do you believe that? And what is the model that China is offering? What is the different model that China is offering the world at a time when Western liberal democracy is being much questioned?
We heard from previous panelists a lot about human dignity, right? Human dignity, and especially education and health, and that's a fundamental part of human dignity. We cannot forget that 90% of the people still living today are living in developing countries. There's also another thing that we talked about, which is inequality. One thing we did not talk about is the reduction in inequality across countries. There's been a significant convergence of economic equality across countries thanks to globalization and none else. So we cannot forget that, even though the two nations posturing the negative impact on the world, the protectionism, really plain old protectionism under the guise of national security is really going to hurt the world. And that 90% of the population, we have to be careful. So I think that should still be the major, moral ground of the day.
Can I press you a little on the model? I mean, the United States and Europe, liberty, democracy, free press, the rule of law, rules-based international order. From China, for a while, we heard the word harmony. I'm not sure I still hear that much. And what is China? Take those words out of the United States or out of Europe, wherever. What words from China would you substitute for those? What is China offering in terms of an organizing principle?
Well, in President Xi's word, I have to see if I can translate this correctly, but something like a common humanity for everyone in the world. And that's China's own vision. The West may not agree, because the West may prioritize things like freedom over security and other things. But in China's view, in the leadership's view, the common good includes the build-up of good infrastructure around the world, the ability to trade freely, the ability to converge, the ability to have access to cheap and good technologies for developing countries, the embetterment of life and the rising of living standards, practical. That's what China is offering.
Pragmatism rather than grand principles.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or exporting a particular China-led model. China has no interest, nor does it believe that it's feasible to export any Chinese model to the rest of the world.
Tom, Biden or Trump, which does China want and why?
Oh, that's an easy one, Raj. Trump by a landslide, because Trump is incapable of forging coalitions. And what challenges China most geopolitically is a coalition stretching from India and Vietnam to the west, to Korea and Japan, to the east, and Singapore to the south. And the Biden administration has been very effective in forging geopolitical coalitions to, well, they don't like to use the word contain, but to balance China and its own power projections into the South China Sea and around the region. And so the very last person China wants to see reelected would be Joe Biden. Trump is, by reasons of both incompetence and disposition, incapable of building alliances.
Despite the fact that President Trump's policies toward China were pretty tough in some regards.
Well, you know, I've always been of the view that Donald Trump is not the American president Americans deserved, but he was the American president China deserved, in the sense that someone had to call the game on trade. The fact is that, well, I go back to those business people who are the last people who would have wanted to move into a more confrontational relationship with China. But there was a feeling, based on innumerable facts, that China was not living up to its obligations under the World Trade Organization in terms of access and opportunity and government intervention. That created a situation where a lot of companies, you know, felt that, you know, the game wasn't worth the candle anymore. Now, that said, a lot are still there and doing a lot of business still. For which, you know, I'm personally glad. I think that the U.S.-China relationship is, you know, look, if you look at the world, Roger, for the last, you know, since last 75 years, the stability of the world over the last 75 years is really built on three things, I would argue. One is American power, upholding the liberal global institutions forged after World War II, the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, and a set of liberal rules. The second pillar is Chinese growth and prosperity that really fueled and economic growth around the world, particularly after 2008. And the third is the stability of the developing world in general, we'll call the third world. What is unnerving today, I would argue, is a growing American isolationism. We see it around Republicans and the continued support for Ukraine that really has no interest in upholding the international order. We see a China that, with a Russia, teaming up with a Russia, that says, you know, we want to write different rules, to which I always actually want to ask, which actually are the rules that you would like to rewrite? I mean, no country has grown faster, and by the way, as I said, grown more people out of poverty faster than China under the rules that you know, America was actually developed and imposed on the world after World War II. And the third thing that's happening is that we're seeing that literally the disintegration of states in the developing world, or their collapse either into dictatorship or to disorder. It's particularly pronounced these days in Africa, but it's also happening in Latin America and obviously in the Asia region as well. And so instead of these states integrating with the world, their people are integrating with the world in the form of mass migration. And so I'm open aspirer that China succeed. Can you imagine a world where China would be like Assyria today or whatever? That would be a disaster for the Chinese people and for the world. A stable China, a growing China is important for the world. But China that throws in its lot with a Putin who is raping Ukraine right now, even though it hasn't, importantly, not sent him weapons to advance that. I think that's been very important.
Isn't it sending weapons via North Korea? And what do you make of the Chinese rapprochement with Russia, allies forever, and so on? How menacing is that to the United States?
I think it's a huge mistake. Vladimir Putin's a loser. His economy. Well, anybody try to buy a Russian watch lately? How about a Russian car? Putin has
Soviet watch, maybe.
Putin has bet his future on fossil fuels, not on investing in his people. The Chinese actually have bet their future on investing in their people and unlocking their entrepreneurship. That's where it's been successful. But I think that I chafe on this notion that we need to rewrite the rules. Well, which rule exactly? And how did you do under the rules that we wrote? The American-built, post-war order. I'd say China did pretty well under those. So I think a lot of that is nonsense, and I don't think it's healthy for China or for the world. So, as I said, I think we're going to have to find our way here. But I do believe that, again, anyone who's visited China, as I have over a long span of time, can't help but notice a change in the degree of openness and the willingness and ability of Chinese professors and business people and officials to speak openly, relatively, and relatively freely about their fate and future. That's just a fact. I mean, people can deny it if they want. That saddens me as someone who's a regular visitor to China. I don't think it's good for China, for China's stability. I think China's going to have to be more open in order to take advantage of the new technologies of the 21st century. And Chinese growth is hugely important for me personally, for the world, for the stability of the world. So just as I ask sometimes my own government, hey, where's this going? I have to ask the same question of China today. Like, where is this going? I mean, we've seen China's foreign minister and defense minister both disappear in the last 4 months. That's unnerving to anyone who, like me, and I know the foreign minister quite well because he was the ambassador in Washington. That's unnerving to someone like me who, again, believes in the importance of the stability of this relationship.
Dingxin, we've heard a fairly optimistic note throughout this debate, that good sense will prevail, that the mutual interests are far too great ever to be upended by war, that China and the United States are doomed somehow to get along. I don't think anybody predicted war in Ukraine last year before it happened. Well, the US did just before war broke out. Europe never did. Nobody predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall. Major eruptions in history tend to come suddenly rather than gradually, as Hemingway observed about bankruptcy. So give us a scenario under which, what do you lie awake at night, if you do lie awake at night, worrying about? I don't see you as somebody who lies awake at night. You look very relaxed, and you told me you're retired. But if you do ever lie awake at night thinking that something terrible might happen, what is the scenario you have in your head?
I guess several scenarios,
Several scenarios?
Yeah, because I don't think Russia is going to win the war.
Pardon?
I don't think Russia is going to win the war.
Yeah.
If they once lost, usually it will be another regime collapse in Russia. And that Chinese will get scared. Many countries will get scared because, like I said, China had a very ambiguous attitude toward Ukraine. Actually, privately, I talked to many people. They thought what Russia did is wrong. But on the other hand, they really afraid that this kind of power vacuum lost, and this can be a trust built with the United States. So they don't want Russia to lose. That's the kind of attitude in China, which I see. So if there's a regime change in Russia, another thing was that China, there's a certain thing goes wrong in China's side, or in Taiwan side, or in Trump's. There's something cannot control because really the hot spot is on the Taiwan Strait. This is a real hot spot. So that's, I think.
So what could go wrong in the Taiwan Strait?
If both sides, for some reason, China start invade, or Taiwan claim independence, or Taiwan claim independence, China to invade, and that create,
I mean, President Biden has said he will defend Taiwan.
Yeah, that could be done.
He will do what he's not done in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think rightly, not put
regardless-
U.S. troops on the ground, but
Yeah.
he has suggested strongly he would in the case of Taiwan,
Yeah.
which is where 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors come
me,
from, which
that's
is not a small issue.
Yeah. To me, I think both sides has to deal with the situation really serious. Not both, China, Taiwan, and United States. And for Taiwan, basically, they should thought carefully, it's so close. Don't tell wagging dogs. Use the leverage to do something for domestic politics. And China too. This is the most serious issue. And once the war starts, and the whole world is ravaging.
Right.
And this is two nuclear powers.
Keyu,
the United States too.
What do you worry about, if anything?
Similar scenarios over Taiwan. I think that, look, let's not underestimate the grave internal challenges that the two countries are facing very differently. China's economy, youth unemployment, in the U.S. social divisions, and China is still very internally focused. But I think, wanting to show a political track record of unifying China is another potential scenario.
The Pentagon banned TikTok this year, I think, on government-issued phones, computers, and so on. TikTok is wildly popular throughout the world. And that goes to Tom's point, about everything is linked and digitally connected these days, and so can have dual use and be dangerous. Do you think that's a constructive measure, a necessary measure, or just a provocation for China?
Well, first of all, from what I understand, 4 out of 5 most popular apps downloaded in the U.S. today are Chinese.
4 out of 5?
Yes.
Which are they?
TikTok, Shein, women's fashion brand, and then Temu, selling cheap Chinese goods to American. I forgot the 4th one, and TikTok, of course. Right. I just want to say there's rhetoric, and there's strong rhetoric. Okay, in China, Marxist-Leninist rhetoric, and the U.S., all that, and posturing. But on the ground is yet another issue. You got to separate the rhetoric from the actions on the ground. In China,
so women's fashion will save us.
Fast fashion is not going to save the earth, though. But on the ground, there's still markets work in China. Entrepreneurs are competing. China's the most competitive ground on earth for companies, and people are still putting their heads down and saying, how can we innovate? How can we use the skill? Same thing in the U.S. It's very sad, and I echo Tom's comments about the lack of cooperation of universities and scientists, which are so necessary between the two countries. But still, there's a lot more going on than we realize. Yeah.
Tom, and I'll throw this open for questions after this question to Tom. Tom, I have to ask you, how dangerous in terms of all we've been talking about, and indeed for democracy in the world, is the possibility of a Trump presidency? The only question I'm ever asked in Europe these days is Trump coming back? There is no other question. I always say, I don't think so. I think Americans in the end have the good sense to see that what a second term does to the already crazed Trump ego is almost too alarming even to contemplate, and that the United States will pull back from that. However, I ran into Richard Haass in New York last week, and I asked him that question, and he surprised me. He said Trump wins. 60%, 60, Trump wins. And Richard Haass is somebody who considers these matters very, very carefully. Do you have the same view? And again, how dangerous would that be not only to American democracy, but to peace in the world?
Well, I'm very unclear about the first question, Raj. Will Trump win? I just don't know. I think it's way, way too early to tell. 100 different things can happen between now and November of 2024. All I would say, though, is we have to take that prospect very seriously, and it would be a disaster. Look, anyone who follows my column know I basically just write about three things. I write about Israel, I write about Ukraine, and I write about Trump. Because my view is that Israel goes autocratic, if Ukraine goes Putin, and America goes Trump, the world that I want to leave for my new little grandson ain't going to be here.
Congratulations.
So, that's all I write about, and those three things. And I think the fate and future of China is also hugely important, but I think that will depend much more on way events inside China evolve. And I do feel the two countries are stumbling toward a better sort of new equilibrium. But Trump could very well win. It's the most disturbing thing in my life today is to pick up the newspaper and see polls that show that more than 50% of the American people, say to a pollster, they would prefer a man who is credibly accused of trying to overturn our government in the wake of an election that he lost, that they're ready to return him to office over not only the other Republican candidates, albeit they a group of total knuckleheads, let alone Joe Biden. So, something's in the water here. It's very, very disturbing to me. I wouldn't put any odds on it right now, right? But it's a very real possibility, which makes my stomach turn.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone. Are there any questions? Yes, the lady with the glasses right here. Yeah. And please ask a question, however tempted you are to make some extensive commentary about the proceedings here. I would be great, because there are a lot of people who want to ask questions, so please just ask a question.
Okay, first, thank you for the discussion. And the question, to what political changes will the recent slowing down and other challenges of Chinese economy lead China? To more political centralization and consolidation of power, including larger market regulations, for example, or more decentralization as kind of bargain with people, like less economic goods and prosperity in exchange of more power? And how will all this will affect Chinese relationships with Taiwan, mainly probability of the military conflict? Thank you.
Did you hear that?
I understood.
Could you answer it? I'm not sure I heard it.
Yes, China's economy is undergoing serious challenges currently.
Right.
And the way, I think it has a major impact. First of all, the legitimacy of the party is the economic performance and delivery to the Chinese people. And as I mentioned, 1 billion people with that level of income is still considering these. So it would be a good thing if there's a return to pragmatism and a little bit less priority on the other stuff we talked about, security and overseas concerns, and focus back on the pragmatic situations. If you look at China's economic development over the last 40 years, there have been up and downs, and every time there's been a major reform. The question is, are they going to push through these reforms? And I end with your answer is that I think there will be more prioritization of the economy, so less, let's say, risks posed for Taiwan because of internal challenges.
Yes, sir. And then you, sir.
Yes, sir. Mr. Friedman, this is to you. About.
Would each of you would you identify yourself, please?
I'm sorry. My name is Will Ritter, and I've covered financial markets in Ukraine out of Kiev since 2008. And Mr. Friedman, about 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago, you wrote a long article about your time in Ukraine. It made a lot of good points. Thank you for that. And the phrase that stuck out, one phrase that stuck out to me from that article was, I believe, was the bad guy still has a say. If you remember that, meaning Putin still has a say, and the U.S. doesn't control the outcome. You know, we don't have full control over the outcome of this war, and it could go on for a long time. So my question is, since China has leverage over Putin to accept less than what he wants, and the U.S. has leverage over Zelensky to force him to accept less than he wants, why don't the U.S. and China work together to try to stop the war, which could otherwise go on for a long time?
Thank you. Tom?
Yes, it's a good and important question. I would, though, I think it would be exaggerating the influence of both powers to say that they could, just like that, in a sense, turn the war on and off. I think China obviously would have a big influence on Russian thinking. I think America, obviously, with its allies, would have a huge impact on Ukrainian thinking. But at the end of the day, for better or for worse, you know, both of the combatants right now feel they have an interest and a desire to achieve their military goals. In the case of Ukraine, it's to liberate every inch of their territory. In the case of Russia, I have no idea what Putin's fighting anymore. To me, this has become, from a Russian point of view, for Putin, Operation Save My Face. Since Putin doesn't even tell us anymore, doesn't even bother of his many explanations for why he invaded Ukraine, what the latest one is. So, you know, I believed and argued from the very beginning of the war that the fact that China has not intervened, you know, by arming Russia, and again, they're sending things like, you know, vests and precursor chemicals that Russia needs for weapons and ships. But basically, China has abided by the request of America and the NATO allies not to intervene in this war. That's been huge. That's why Putin had to go to North Korea. And for Putin to have to go to North Korea for arms, as I said in that column, it's like the biggest bank in your city going to a pawn shop for an injection of cash. That's a sign of real desperation. So I think we should take that seriously. That is an opening, you know, for us. When the time comes, I think your question is very apposite, that it could be the U.S. and China somehow, you know, collaborating to bring about an end to the war. But it's not just an end to the fighting. I do believe Ukraine must be in NATO and the European Union ultimately, NATO first, to have a stable border now between Russia and Ukraine, because the minute the war ends, Ukrainians will never trust Putin not to come back and try to rape their country again unless there's it's part of NATO, and that is off the table.
Of course, being in NATO, given Article 5, while the war continues, is very problematic, and that's the position President Biden has taken. Yes, sir.
Thank you. So my name is Durar. I'm from Kazakhstan, but I study in Hong Kong. So my country borders with Russia, China, and have good connection with United States. So my question is, how the countries like mine who have connections with both countries, and how will be the future, and what is the case strategies, and just the overall condition? Yep.
Do you want to answer that, Dingxin?
I have a very little comment on this. So you're from Hong Kong?
No. I study in Hong Kong, but I'm from Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan, okay.
Yes.
And I think that, you know, for the countries which is in the Central Asia, they have little borders, like like Mongolia and all those things. They actually had to deal with their giant neighbors, like Russia, like China in a way more seriously. And the United States could help, but certainly not help. The United States have not reached to that England. And also, for those Central Asia countries, there's also, they face their own problem, rise of Islamic fundamentalism, desecularization. Though they do have an interest collaborating with China, with other countries on those issues, even on terrorism, on many other things. So I guess, another also you need to deal with the rise of a trouble power, again. So there's several things you need to dealing with, but I guess a more subtle, delicate dealing with those big countries like United States, China, Russia, that's some kind of balance should be needed.
Anybody else? Yes, sir?
Thank you. I'm Manolis Vordonis, an elderly Athenian who walks in the Agora, Parthenon, and resonates to the vibrations of the old Athenians who created democracy. So I want to pick up a few of your words and make a question. The words hatred, war, win, lose, threat, and also take the word.
I'm sorry, sir, we have 3 minutes left. If you could ask a question, it would be great.
Okay.
We don't have
The question
time. I'm
is-
sorry, we don't have time for a
The
comment.
question is, if we do want to have hope from democracy, can we hope that we will reverse these phobic, dominating feelings which are leading us to war, and sleepless nights?
Thank you very much. Keyu, would you like to?
I think, the theme of the conference is also democracy, and we talked a lot about building a resilient democracy and how to rebuild democracy. I think for the Chinese, at least from the Chinese perspective, if there was a paradigm, a Western paradigm of democracy that really functioned very well and that really delivered, then I think that's more of a challenge to the Chinese people. And if you ask me if the Chinese people want
You're saying
more...
our democracies are dysfunctional currently?
I'm not suggesting that.
You did.
There are problems.
Okay.
There are challenges.
Yeah.
But if the Chinese people have observed what's going on with Western democracy or democracies transposed onto native soil, it's not necessarily an inspiration to the Chinese people. That's why they don't have this, this view of a radical overhaul of what they have.
But do you think they get an objective or dispassionate picture of what is actually going on in Western societies? Or do you think they get propaganda mainly?
No, to be honest, the information flows are very free-flowing. There's a certain topics of censorship, but apart from that, look, they travel, and there's so many in Greece, right? So if the question is, do they want a freer and opener society, the answer is yes. But is the solution in more Western democracy? Not necessarily.
Okay, Tom, very quickly, a last question to you, and thanks again for getting up so early to do this. Is climate an area where China and the US can come together? A big overarching issue?
Well, there was a study done where people were asked if the world were invaded by Martians, would the leaders of China and the United States agree to collaborate? And the answer was blessedly yes. And there's no question, Raj, that it's a fertile area for collaboration. It has been in the past. It's been less so of late. But until it reaches a level of criticality where I would say it's already at, I think a lot of us would agree, and you would agree that it's already there, but isn't perceived that way. I don't think you can count on it to trump everything else, and to use an unfortunate verb. And so, at the end of the day, I've advocated that Xi Jinping and President Biden, whoever is the American president, actually should speak on the phone once a month. And no matter what's going on, just pick up the phone once a month and be able to say, hey, what you're doing here is really pissing me off. What I'm finding here is really bothering me. And hey, could you do a little more of that, or could we do a little more of that? The fact that we put everything on these annual or semi-annual summits, you know, where there's like a 2-hour meeting with translation, I think is simply not any more, you know, effective or in any way rises to the level of kind of discussion and collaboration that we need between these two countries. And so I don't say conversation solves everything, but it can it can reduce tensions. It can lead to working together on smaller problems, and then open the way for some of the bigger questions. But net, you know, I'm still slightly hopeful about the relationship, because anytime I think about the question of U.S. and China, I always end up asking myself, right, what exactly are we fighting about? It's not like China wants to invade Los Angeles and take over Chinatown. It's not like America aspires, you know, to take a bite out of Guangzhou. So, you know, I think the more we work together, and the more that both sides underline that, but you know, play by the rules of an international order, albeit an American-inspired one. China and America have both done pretty well under the rules of the game that America helped forge and defend for 75 years. And until I see a better set of rules that I think will benefit more people, I'm sticking with the ones we have.
Thank you very much, Tom. Well, we've had a generally optimistic panel, which doesn't always happen here. And thank you all very much. Apologies to those who had questions that I wasn't able to get to, notably you, man. And there we are. That's it. Thank you.